bit of a chat about swales and how they work. They're not the most complicated ones, let's say, so it shouldn't take long. Then we'll talk a bit about how we do flood risk mitigation and design retarding basins here in Australia. At risk of telling you how to do your job, because I'm sure you all know how to do that really well anyway. But I'll just talk about what we do here and sort of the approaches we take. And then we'll talk a little bit about urban heat and passively irrigated straight tree pits, which is one of the responses we like to use for urban heat. And then in the last session, I want to talk about what we've been focusing on in the last few years as an industry, which is turning our attention from just dealing with pollution to starting to look more seriously at flow volumes. And we'll talk a little bit about rainwater tanks and stormwater harvesting. So that's the agenda. A biofilter or a rain garden, I guess they've got the name rain garden for a reason, and people sort of say, well, why do you call it a rain garden? Rain falls on all the gardens. Essentially the idea is that it is a garden that's designed to capture the rain, capture the runoff that's coming off the area, and it's really just a depressed garden. It's not that different to how we set up an ordinary garden, it's just depressed in the landscape. And then the way we design them in Australia, we nearly always put an engineered filter media of some kind into them. But there's no reason that couldn't just be a soil, as long as it's reasonably freely draining and has a few other characteristics we're looking for. I just mentioned, so this is a biofilter here, sorry, this is a biofilter here at Sunvale Community Park. So you can see the facilities in the background. We've got the walking path, we've got barbecue areas, playgrounds are sort of obscured. Just behind us, out of sight, there's actually also a kind of a remembrance for the First Nations people of the area. So there's a little mosaic in the path. So there's a few other features in this park. It's more than just the water sensitive urban design that was designed when we did this park. But it brings it all together. And one of the things with these rain gardens is that not only are they intended to be a landscape feature in themselves, but they're also treating the water so that we can collect it into a stormwater harvesting tank. And then we're using the water from that to actually irrigate the park, so you can see it's nice and green. Essentially with the biofilter, water will come in at the top. It'll either come directly or from other catchments around it usually. There will be what we call extended detention depth. So remember we talked yesterday about the top of extended detention and extended detention depth. Exactly the same thing in a biofilter. That's just to give time for the water to be able to soak into the filter media and then go through the system. So we have this shallow ponding area. The difference between this and a wetland is that if we get a storm event lasts for an hour, say, that will fill us up and this will drain within a couple of hours tops. The water will soak into the filter media and then it will go through the system and then it will come out the outlet pipe. So usually we'll only see these being wet for hours at a time, not days or weeks like we see for a wetland. So that's the substantial difference. So if you go and look at one of these systems, it should be dry unless it's raining and then it will be wet. If you go there that day when it's just rained, you might be lucky, there might still be some water there, but otherwise they're nearly always going to be dry. So that's the big difference you'll see, and as you go and look at a few, you'll notice that. As I said, in Australia, we nearly always put a quite sandy filter media in, and the CRC for Water Sensitive Cities, which is the precursor to Water Sensitive Cities Australia, actually wrote the specifications for how to do this filter media. We then have some drainage layers underneath, and we get the water out usually. So a couple of examples. That one I just showed you is obviously in a park. This is another one up in Queensland. So again, you can see that we're taking advantage of the fact that we've got an open space in a park. We're putting the biofilter and the stormwater treatment within that space, and we're looking at how we can integrate this with the surrounds. In this case, it's quite a natural setting. So we've gone for this sort of natural rock look in the batters around it. In a more urbanised setting, we might use concrete or something else. So we try to match what we do with the rain garden to fit and align with the surroundings. This is the same one you just saw on the previous one, but this is showing you the inlet to it. What you can see is the inlet to this one's pretty questionable. It's got this tiny little slot, the slotted drain running through into here We've had a lot of trouble getting grading from this road to actually be able to grade into here and get into the rain garden and then get it down to the depth where the water could drain into it, but not be too deep for the rest of the park. And this is a common challenge you'll find everywhere you're trying to do rain gardens, is that tension between the surface level and how deep you need to be to get the water into it. So you're always fighting grade, and that'll be, you'll see that's always a challenge. So that's the, oh no, sorry, that one, that's the First Nations little mosaic I mentioned. Jump in will know this one really well because he was involved in the design of this. This is another biofilter in Singapore. One of the early demonstrations that this technology can actually work in a tropical setting in a tropical country, and we can get it to function effectively. And it looks really nice in this picture, as you can see. And then another one here. So this is a development in the southeastern suburbs of Melbourne. So again, we've got biofilter, got the rock work around it, new housing estate. You'll go and see this one, I believe, on your study tour. So hopefully it's still looking good. No promises, but hopefully that's what it looked like in the early days. So the main thing with these is that they're in a park, there's space, you can grade and batter it out, you can integrate it with the landscape, you've got lots of opportunity for how that fits in. But we can also put these in a streetscape, and we don't have the luxury of all that space when you're in a streetscape, so we've got to think a lot harder about how we get all these grades to work to get from the road, garden bed, then down into the rain garden, but have gravel batters on the sides. You'll see we've got the inlet here, we've got a grate so people can walk across it if they need to. So we're much more constrained for space. This is one of our favourite ways of doing it in a street though. What we do is at the end of the street we don't have any car parking. So where there's an intersection where two roads are meeting, we don't have any cars parked just on that little point. So that's where we put a rain garden in if we can, and that's where we have a bit more space. We're lucky that the streets in this area are relatively wide for the nature strip in some areas, so that gives us the space to get this rain garden in and make it work. And this one's a similar one. Again, you can see you've got the path, you've got a garden to give a bit of an offset, so that if someone steps off the path, if you're drunk at night, pushing the pram or whatever, they just go into the garden, no harm done, no one's hurt, whatever. And then the grade is over here, so this then grades down into the rain garden, so we've separated that from the path for safety. Other side, you'll see the same thing, there's a garden, that's all terrestrial planting around the edge of it. And then you'll see we've got the grade down into the rain garden. Again, as I mentioned, fighting grade, it's always hard to get the water from a road into a rain garden and manage that drop. So it's always the main challenge. So we use these all the time in streetscapes because they're just probably the most effective treatment to fit in, and they're the most versatile and modular. So we've got median strip type, where you've got it running down a median strip in the middle. Well, this one's on the side, but similar idea, it's bioswale and water's flowing along it, but we've still got the filter media underneath it. Median strips are good because they're away from the footpath and you don't have to deal with all those issues of grade. And in this case, we're using these broken curbs, which means that the water can flow in all the way along the road. It's got a way to get into the system, but the cars aren't going to come in, so it gets that balance between the flow in, but no cars coming in, because we don't want cars in our biofilters. That's probably one of the nicer looking ones you'll see. Some of them don't look that nice, I'll be honest. This is another bump out version. So hopefully these are giving you a few ideas about different ways that we can set these systems up. What you can see is that they're quite flexible in how they work. You can put them in lots of different areas. So this is just a small bump out on quite a narrow street. Again, grade, probably questionable whether the water will actually get from the gutter back up into the system, because we actually need the water to drain back against the grade of the road. Keep in mind that the road will have a crown in the middle, so it'll grade up and down like that. So we're always fighting that grade to try and get the water back in.
So, sorry, that one in the corner, is that working?
I would say it's questionable whether that's working at all, or whether the water is just flowing straight down the gutter, going right past it. The best we can hope for is that it's pretty sandy here, and as the water spills over the gutter, it won't go into the gravel and the sand at the top. That might make its way in, or get some water in a decent rain, but I would say it's probably questionable whether that's working at all.
So how would you fix that to make it work?
Honestly, you probably need to get in and dig down, which means you're going to lose all your plants. Your other option is if you made this permeable pavement and then put sand underneath it and under the rain garden, that would mean that the water could still drop in and still soak across it. Obviously, you've got clogging risks if you do that, but that would be one way of getting the water in. So the other is that we dig this out, we grade it down, but the flip side of that is you end up with a drop like that on the rear side of the curb because we're trying to grade against the grade of the road. So this ends up being a really steep drop. And then the risk we have with that is if a car manages to drive over this and get over the other side, if it's too deep on that side, they get stuck. Car hits the gutter, wheels running free, and then they can't drive back out of it. And there's a couple in Inkerman Street, just near the Port Phillip Town Hall, where they've had that problem because they've put these on the street corner. All the cars are trying to cut the corner all the time. They cut the corner, run over the curb, and then they get stuck. And that's happened 2 or 3 times at least. So streetscape rain gardens are great. Put them in streets where you can, but also think carefully about where you put them, because not everywhere is going to work. And if it's getting too hard, too marginal, cut your losses, go and find a better site, go and find somewhere where it's a bit easier to get it in, because they're not going to work in every location. So look for the sites where you've got more space and good opportunity, the really good spots to put it. At the moment, you haven't got any or hardly any of these assets, so look for all the best opportunities you can find. Don't waste your time getting caught up on really difficult marginal ones where you're going, oh, will this work, won't it work, it might. Just go and find the easiest spot to do it, obviously. Right, so done that one. So the other spot you can put these is in private allotments or private development. So this one's actually a couple of blocks from your hotel in the city. This is in Federation Square, in the back of the car park. So they didn't want it too obvious, so they've hidden this one away right out the back. Just put in a biofilter there, so it's taking the runoff from the car park and then treating that out the back. We've also got rainwater tanks. And this is one in a backyard, so it's sitting in the back of a small townhouse, collects water off the roof, runs through a hose into it, waters it, and then filters through it. So this is actually my townhouse. So this was an experimental biofilter we did a few years ago because we had the idea that we were going to make these, sell them to people. But we worked out that what was happening is that people were designing these, putting them on the plans, council were approving it, but then council was not checking if anyone was building these. So we ended up giving up on this idea because there weren't enough of them being constructed 10 years ago that we were trying to do this. Because the builders had worked out that no one was checking if they built it or not, so they were just not putting it in the ground. So it's happening now though. We're getting more progress. Some councils are actually going and checking and inspecting the houses to make sure the rainwater tank's connected, plumbed where it's meant to be, and the rain garden's in the ground.
So is that one elevated?
Yeah, so this is a planter box rain garden, so it's a little bit like the ones that you've been experimenting with at the, what's the name of the university? Bangkok? Yeah. It's a little bit like those ones. The only difference is that the people I was working with at the time wanted to make it look nice, so we just put a few things around it to pretty it up. But otherwise it's pretty much the same. So let's talk about the different elements of the biofilter. So you've got obviously an inlet, water flows into the system. It's got to get in somehow. Usually it'll be a piped inlet, sometimes it'll just be spilling across the curb. You've got the filter media and the surface, you've got the batters, you've got an overflow pit of some kind, and that may be in the biofilter, it might actually sit outside it sometimes. Sometimes it's just your normal curb inlet. And then you've got your under drainage and your outlet pipe as well. It's not a great drawing, that's the surface. So for your inlet, There's a few ways of doing this. We can have a curb inlet, we can have a swale or a channel coming into the system, we can have a pipe, or we can just have overland flow coming straight into the system. So we need to think about how do we get water in, but we don't necessarily want all the sediment coming in. So we think with the inlet about, can we set up the inlet so that it captures sediment at it? So we might have a concrete apron, or we might have some rocks, might have a little bit of an area that's slowing the water down so the sediment can settle out. But then we also want to keep cars out, so we've got to make sure that the inlet's small enough that people can't drive into our rain garden or park on it or anything like that as well. Sometimes when we do these, we will have pre-treatment. So the smaller assets, generally you'll see the water will just come straight off the road and flow in. But a larger asset that we're putting in a park, we'll often put a sediment basin upstream of that to capture the sediment. So that's when you're covering the sediment, and that's then clogging the system up. Second thing is sometimes we'll put a litter trap to stop it getting rubbish flowing into it if it's a large system, because it can get pretty onerous to go and pick all the rubbish out of the plants if it's a really big system. If it's a small streetscape one, that's okay, it's not too hard. We did look at one that was in front of a hairdresser, and it was at the end of the street, and all the rubbish kept getting washed down the street into that one rain garden, and it also blew from the areas around it. So the poor hairdresser was going out cleaning out the rain garden every few days because it was getting full of rubbish. So we had to ask the council to give that one a bit of extra effort. So this is probably a better way of illustrating the inlets. So as I said, we've got these sort of broken curves which allow the water in at multiple locations. This is a really good design because it distributes the inflow and it distributes any sediment coming in, so it spreads things out. So you don't have a single point of failure that if you get a blockage, it stops water getting into the system. So this is a really effective way of getting the water in. This is not dissimilar, but you can see we can't have just broken curbs everywhere, so they've got a number of breaks along so that the water can get in from the road at different locations. You can see we've got these rocks here to try and sort of break up the flow as it comes in and provide a spot where we can catch some of the sediment. So the water will flow in through here and then make its way through the system. Various types of curb inlets, you'll see a couple as I show you pictures during the day. So you've got a lintel with just an opening, you let the water flow through. They probably didn't really need anything on top of this one here, but they have. Grates, sometimes we use little concrete blocks within these just to break it up and stop things coming in. You'll see there's all sorts of different designs. This with the gutter just coming straight in is pretty common, but as we just discussed in that other one, it's not a great design because you always end up with this sitting higher than the gutter. So we've always got problems with grade with these, but it's one way of getting the water into them. With these, what I would actually suggest is what we should do is build the rain garden all the way into the nature strip and extend it right through, because that's a bit unimaginative. They've used the car park, but they could have easily extended that into the grass here. And then this would have then been in the middle of the rain garden, sitting right in the filter media, and the water would have just drained straight into the system. And then this is all on grade at the surface, but that sand layer is then flat underneath it, so the water will actually make its way through and spread underneath it. So there's ways and means of managing those levels if we think about it. So we've then got that temporary detention at the top, and this is again always a difficult conversation with these streetscape ones because we want it as deep as possible to get the water in, but we're fighting grade, so we want to make it really shallow. Usually we make it at least 100 millimetres, so about that deep. And the reason for that is that if you make it too shallow, it's very easy for it to be compromised. Someone brings in some gravel mulch, fills it up a bit, it's gone. Someone misjudges the levels a bit, you've got no extended detention at all. So we've got to be a bit careful to make sure that we retain that. At the same time, we don't want it really deep because, as I said, if the car drives in, they can't get out again. We've got tripping hazards of people stepping into it and that sort of thing if it's too much of a drop. Drowning isn't a huge thing with biofilters because, as I said, they fill and they drain really quickly, but you've also got to think about those kind of risks if you're in a residential area. So we're always choosing a depth that's balancing functional performance versus the other outcomes and surrounds that we're dealing with. Going down underground now, we have the filter media, which will dictate how quickly water can soak into the system. It'll provide a growing medium for the plants, so it needs to be freely growing enough that the water will flow in easily, but also it needs to be able to retain a bit of nutrients and be able to support the plants. So it's a bit of a balancing act. So we don't want lots of nutrients, we want low nutrient, but not no nutrient. So we don't want to just put sand in these systems because the plants just won't grow. So we've got to have some nutrients in the system, we've got to have a little bit of loam or material that the plants can grow in, but we want it to be quite freely grown usually. Transition and drainage layers, these are essentially just to allow the system to drain out, so I'll put a bit more detail on them. So, talk in depth about the filter media. So these are the specifications for Australia, but I'm not suggesting that you necessarily have to follow them in Thailand because you'll be adapting their systems to meet what soils you can access and have available, what you're trying to achieve. So whether you want to use this as a treatment and get water through it and get it out really quickly, or whether you're using it to hold and absorb water and then maybe just water the trees, depends what your primary objective is. So if we're using it for treatment, usually we'll aim for at least 400 or 500 mil deep, and that's so that there's enough depth in it that it holds enough water that the plants have some water to keep them alive through some of the dry periods. In Australia, we're often also doing this thing we call a submerge zone, where we elevate the outlet of the system so that any water in here is trapped and can't drain out, and that's held in storage, either with a liner sometimes, or we just put it in clay and we know that it's not going to go anywhere very quickly. And what that means is that the plants can put their roots down and they can either directly access that water, or the capillary action will pull that water back up through the system and pull it back up into the sand, and then the plants will be able to access that water. And you'd be surprised, even a reasonably coarse sand can actually pull the water up 200, 300, even 400 millimetres against gravity quite readily. And that was, quite possible. So in terms of drainage, we have these really high infiltration rates that we designed to in Australia, sort of 100 to 300 mil an hour. I actually specify 100 to 200 mil an hour in all the designs that we do at E2 Design. That's because if it's too high, the water runs through it too quickly and it doesn't leave enough water for the plants. And what we're seeing with the outcomes of the material we use in Australia is that we don't really have issues with it not draining quickly enough, but we do have problems with it draining too quickly and not leaving enough water to keep the plants going. So we do need some nutrients in it. So there's some recommendations about appropriate ranges for nitrogen, 400 to 800 milligrams a kilogram. Phosphorus we want to keep low because we don't want phosphorus getting into our waterways because that will then help algae to grow. So we want to keep the phosphorus content low because the last thing we want to do is stuff our system with compost and then find that we're actually leaching more phosphorus than we're capturing. And that's been a big problem for the rain gardens in the United States when they're testing them, because they often mix the sand that they're using with compost. So they'll say 80% sand, 20% compost mix. And not surprisingly, compost breaks down, stuff leaches out, and then you see there's phosphorus coming out, and you've got more material going out than was going in. So we've got to get that balance right. The current guidelines say organic content less than 5%, but again we're saying don't make it zero. Have some organic content to keep the plants alive. And just a couple of things. I'm sure as you go and look at systems tomorrow and the days after, you'll see rock mulch all over them. Sometimes the rock mulch is this deep and it's big stones and things like that. The idea of the mulch is that it reduces evapotranspiration and it suppresses the weeds. However, what we find is it also stops the plants from growing and spreading. And it also becomes a really hot environment for the plants. It can actually kill the plants, especially if it's too deep. So we're actually recommending to cut back on the mulch. And in some cases we're actually getting rid of it altogether and just having open sand. But to compensate for that, what we are doing is we're planting these systems really densely because if you're not putting mulch in, you'll get weeds growing. So you've either got to plant really densely so that the plants get established quickly, except you're going to lose a few because you put extra in, or you've got to be prepared to come back and weed the system for the first year or two to make sure that you keep those weeds down until your plants are grown up, and once they're big enough, then they'll shade out those weeds. So as I mentioned, the CRC wrote the guidelines on how to design biofilters, and they've got a good specification on how to do the media. It is a relatively sandy media. We are starting to move away from that and look for more organic mixes that have some nutrients, not too much like sledging, but have some nutrients in it and better support the plants. So if you look up Healthy Land and Water, that's the capacity building organisation in Queensland, and I'll have a link later on, you'll see that they've actually got some new guidelines for new biofilter media, which has a little bit more organic content. So have a look at those as not as a guideline you're necessarily going to follow, but have a look at those as an alternative viewpoint on what filter media could be in a rain garden. Keeping in mind, there's no right or wrong answer to this. It's just about getting the balance of water can get into it, water can flow through, it's stable and it's not breaking down, but it also supports the plants and the plants can grow. That's what we want at the end of the day.
I just wanted to mention these guidelines, we've had them translated into Thai. Well, it's not completed, but they're in the process of being translated into Thai. Should be available in the next month. Mm-hmm. And I also put the English version in the folder with all the material. And also, because it's obviously Australian guidelines, I mean, the general functionality is going to be the same. It's soil, water, plants, right? Yeah. But we also plan to do like a note or a technical brief that will, for example, with the support of a pollution control department, to explain how these guidelines can be adapted to a Thai context. So these are some things that we're doing that hopefully will be useful for you as well.
Yes.
That's fantastic. Mm-hmm. Much easier if they translate it for you. And honestly, there's two main guidelines that we refer to when we're doing biofilter design. This is one of those two guidelines. So if you've got that, that's a huge step up. Melbourne Water also have a guideline for biofilters. So because we're working in Victoria, we have to meet their specification requirements. So we tend to follow that guideline. Honestly, it's more prescriptive, saying this is how Melbourne Water want you to design biofilters if they're in Melbourne Water's area. So there's some good advice around sediment pretreatment, things like that, but most of the useful stuff is in here anyway. I will say the Melbourne guideline, the other thing it does really well is it does talk about maintenance, and there's a lot of emphasis on providing maintenance access and how to do maintenance. Probably a little over the top, but it's good advice. So that it is useful for them. All right. So moving on, transition layer. So the transition layer is exactly what it says it is. The only purpose of the transition layer is to provide a barrier between the filter media and the drainage layer, so that the filter media doesn't fall into the drainage layer and get washed out the bottom of the system. That's its only purpose and function. So the only thing we need to do with the transition layer is make sure that the fine particles within it are fine enough that the filter media can't fall into it, basically. So we've just got to get an overlap of the particle sizes so that the media can't fall through the system. And then on the other side, we've got to make the same thing. It's got to be coarse enough for the coarser particles in it that it can't fall into the drainage layer and then get washed through. So it's just about having a series of layers of different grades in series so that the material is stable and it can't move through. So we don't want too much fine material within it that can move through the profile. It's technically possible to get away without a transition layer and just have a drainage layer and filter media, but it's pretty hard to get the material grading right, so it's much easier to just do a transition layer. You'll have to talk to your soil and your aggregate, your gravel suppliers back in Thailand to talk about what materials they can supply you with. As a suggestion, stuff that's used for golf courses, we've actually found works pretty well for biofilter media. The only issue we had with it is that the material wasn't always being supplied consistently in exactly the same grade, because they tend to get a variety of stuff. So they've had to make specific biofilter material, but it actually works pretty well. So that's a possible starting point. With the transition layer, it's essentially just sand. And then with the drainage layer, generally that will be gravel. So say fine aggregate. So it's just basically, you want gravel, but you don't want, so you want small gravel, but you don't want the really fine material in it. So you don't want like the crushed rock type stuff where, if you wash it, you get a whole heap of fines coming out. So you want a washed gravel. We'll then have under drainage. This picture doesn't show it very well, but we'll have what we call called an agricultural pipe or an aggie pipe in Australia, but essentially it's either a slotted pipe or it's got small perforations in it, so it lets the water soak into it and then come back to the outlet. And then I mentioned this submerged zone that we've got. So this is where we've got a space in the bottom of it where the water is trapped and held, and that helps to hold the water for the plants. As a general practice and principle at E2 Design Lab, because we're designing these systems and we want to encourage infiltration into the surrounding landscape, we'll actually not line these systems. And that's because we know in Melbourne the clay is really heavy, water drains slowly anyway. And let's be honest, if the water drains, it's not going anywhere. It might be a little bit around here and it's going to soak into that clay. The plants will be able to access it anyway. So we don't usually line these systems unless we have no choice at all. The only two situations where we will line a biofilter is one where there's ground conditions that we have to worry about. So it's either what we call sodic soils, so clay soils that are dispersive and will react to water coming into them and they'll break down. Or contamination in the soil. And then the second instance is if we're building a biofilter for stormwater harvesting and we want to capture all the water because we want to reuse it. So we don't want to lose any. So then we'll line the system so that we get the water. But otherwise we'll usually leave this unlined and rely on the clay to make sure that this drains slowly enough that it does the job. So overflow does what it says it does. Too much water coming into the system. These rain gardens are always designed for small design storm events. We might say 1 in 3 month flow, 1 in 1 year flow maximum is all you're going to expect a typical biofilter to treat. And the idea is that that's treating the majority of flows most of the time, most of the days it rains. But you get a big storm event, fills up, goes over the overflow, and then discharges safely through other drainage systems. We need to think about blockage when you're designing these, so we usually have a grate over them, or you just have a side entry pit adjacent to or next to the rain garden, so that the water can get into that. And the capacity of this overflow should be at least as much as the capacity of the inlet to make sure that if there's water coming in, there's too much, then it's always going to be able to get through that overflow and it's not going to go and start flooding your street or flooding your footpath or something you didn't expect. And then, so outlet, so it's fairly common. So we'll have the outlet pipe running through. It's often elevated, and then we'll have a pit next to the rain garden or in the rain garden. So this will be elevated within the pit, and then it will discharge out back to the street drainage. So one thing to keep in mind with biofilters is that we need an outlet most of the time, unless your soils are really freely draining or it's really large relative to catchment. You're going to need an outlet, you're going to need a connection back to the drainage system. So the first thing to check when you're designing this for a street is, have we got drainage in the street? Because if you haven't got drainage, it's going to be very difficult to build a biofilter. That said, in the US, they do actually build these systems without drainage, but they'll usually do it at a house scale. So they'll put it in someone's front yard or backyard. The roof will drain into it and then they'll just let it soak into the rain garden. You can get away with it at that small scale because there's not so much water and it can soak into the soil around it. But usually you want drainage. Okay. Just some detail on those outlet pipes for how we get it. So essentially we have the pipe, we'll have a riser, and so what we'll do is we'll cap this one off. So that's just for maintenance. So that pipe will be capped, so it's just for maintenance if we need to drain it. And then this will be the outlet, so it will force the water to pond up to that level, come into the pipe, pond up and then spill out there, and then go back to our drainage. So that's a that's a good illustration of the type of detail we'll typically use in these submerged zone systems. The only caveat I put is that we'll put the pipe into the pit, and that this riser will be inside the pit itself, not sitting in the rain garden, and that means that the construction's a lot simpler, and if something happens or goes wrong, you can access that pipe because it's physically in the pit. Other thing that's a good idea when we're doing these pipe connections is to always put a 45-degree bend rather than a 90-degree bend when you can. And the reason for that is that if for some reason this pipe gets blocked, everyone's always terrified of tree roots getting into these and blocking them up because trees are always trying to go for our pipes. Actually, we find that they don't often go into the pipes as long as there's plenty of water through the submerged zone, or if there's no submerged zone, as long as the water can freely drain through the pipe, they don't tend to go for it. But the reason we do the 45-degree bends is that you can then stick pipe cleaning thing down it, and you can clean the pipes out if you need to. So just keep that in mind as you're doing your design. So a few things for design. It's worth considering what do we want to achieve out of this biofilter. So are we aiming for stormwater treatment? Are we aiming for, are we aiming to make it look really nice because it's in a really public area and it's really visible? Are we trying to create habitat, in which case we might go and choose different plants? We might intentionally put rocks in it so that there's habitat for frogs or lizards or something else. We also need to think about maintenance and designing for that to make sure that that's easy. But it's also worth thinking, are we designing for stormwater harvesting? Are we designing just for passive irrigation of this landscape? John Ben, you mentioned that in Bangkok the priority might be less about stormwater treatment and it might be more for passively irrigating the landscape and getting water to the trees and making it look nice, and also capturing some of that water and retaining the water and losing the volume, because you've obviously got challenges with flood mitigation, so every little bit of water you can catch in the landscape will help. Recognising that it's going to feel like a teaspoon when we're looking at a system of this size. But you've got to start somewhere.
It's about reducing combined soil flows.
Yeah, exactly.
So one of the principles we talk about is the keep water in the landscape.
Yeah.
So gives those features so above the water never goes into combined soil.
Yeah, that's right. And it's probably recognising that in a major storm event, your combined soils are all going to be engaged, but it's about thinking about the frequent storm events that are just enough to engage those combined soils, and it's trying to reduce the frequency that happens and how much volume is going into them when it does. That's where we can start to make a bit of difference. Okay, so I'll go through these. So location is something we need to think about. What are the outcomes we're looking for? Is this a suitable spot for a biofilter, and is it going to work? I drove past this biofilter today. This is one of the first or earliest biofilters built in Melbourne, probably. In fact, you would have driven past this today. So it's now got a tree in it, but all the other plants have died off because this is a really hot, intense sort of environment with roads all around it. So obviously the plants are struggling to survive in that fairly difficult environment. So we've got to think about what's a good location and what are the outcomes that we're trying to achieve here. So these will work really well for streetscapes where you've got a bit of space. They work well in car parks. So we use biofilters a lot in car parks. In between the car parking, have a narrow strip of biofilter, put trees in that, and then you're getting water coming off the car parking, which has got oil and whatever in it, so it's treating that. But then you've also got the trees, which are then providing some shade for the cars. So it's a bit of a win for everyone if you can do that. Next to footpaths, obviously another good spot. And then median strips, nature strips, etc. So it's worth thinking about what sort of setting you're working with. If you're dealing with a really high pedestrian setting, your safety responses are going to be different to what they'll be if you don't have to deal with that. So you might have fencing here, you might have a seat or something to stop people going from the footpath into the biofilter. In this case, it's quite an urbanised, quite a hard-edged setup. In another setting, you might go for something a bit softer and more landscaped. So think about what is the setting that you're trying to fit it into and what's appropriate for that setting. This is the opposite extreme, so this is just an industrial area or a low density residential area. You've got space. We're just going to keep it low tech and just cut a hole in the curb and then just dig the rain garden into the nature strip behind it. Doesn't matter if it's a little bit deep, there's a bit of a drop there because no one's walking there anyway, let's be honest. So we can have a really low tech and also low cost solution because basically you just got filter media. Curb cut costs you hardly anything, so it's a much cheaper solution than having to build all this concrete and stuff around it. Different approaches, putting them between the car parking. Like I said, if we can get some trees providing shade for the cars, that's a good way of getting some trees into the landscape, but also having car parking. You can see again these sort of curb openings so that we can get the water in, but we keep the cars out. Again, that's a tree with car parking either side. Similar ideas. Oh, there you go. Talking about car parks, there's a good one with the car park draining into a biofilter at the end of it. Other thing to think about is, I talked about those grading difficulties. So sometimes you can get creative rather than saying, oh, this is a problem, what do we do with this? Put in some seats, problem solved. Don't have to worry about the grading anymore. People can stick their feet over it if they want, no worries. And then you've got a barrier that has a logical purpose and a reason to be there, so it's not just a fence. And it's adding some amenity to the area. So that's useful in the right circumstance. You've got to ask yourself, would someone want to sit here? Is it a sensible spot to sit? Will there be a tree so there's some shade? Are they looking at something nice? So you've got to think about where you put it, but it can work really well in some locations. So this is a good one to illustrate just a couple of those concepts I was talking about. So we've got negotiating those grades from the road, we've got the garden bed, then we've got a step down, then we've got a second garden bed, then a step down into the rain garden proper, and that's to navigate that grade difference between the road and then getting into the rain garden. Adjacent to the parking here, you can't see it very clearly, but we've got a narrow strip of pavement so that people getting out of their car have something to step onto. That's one of the learnings that we had in the early days. We put gardens right next to, or rain gardens right next to people parking, maybe stepping out into the garden and tripping over. So think about the people that are using the space. Don't just think about the rain garden, but ask yourself, if I was trying to get out of that car, what if I'm on crutches or something? The last thing I want to be doing is stepping down into this. So we've got to make sure we're providing safe access around these systems. Again, you'll see, so there's the inlet here, there's usual challenges of grade. We've dealt with that issue of the gutter, and then we can't get distribution through the system, so this is now flat all the way through here. But the consequence, because the road's grading against us, is that we've now got, I think it's 300 or 400 mil of grade we had to get down to get back down into the rain garden here. So that's always the challenge. Overflow pit is set just below the inlet so that we can get as much water as possible filling up this before it goes over the overflow. Actually, it's on it like so. Looks nice there, right? But still looks good. So a couple of design. This is over in Adelaide. So again, you see familiar patterns. You see there's open curb openings. Notice also the distinctive edge here. So that's actually intentional. So it's changing the pattern, it's changing the texture, it's changing the feel of the paving around it. Again, that's an intentional thing so that people have an indication that they're going into something different before they step right into the garden. So they go, oh, that feels different. What's going on? They've got some warning. Someone blind is tapping along. They're like, oh, that feels different. Sometimes we'll actually put tactile strips around these so that someone who's blind can tell that that's a spot they shouldn't go into. Similar location. So private-public interfaces are always tricky. It's hard to get water from the private space into the public and into the streetscape, so it's very rare to see this kind of interaction. But in this case, they said, well, put a downpipe right here on the building, let's just point that straight into the rain garden, treating the roof runoff, making sure the rain garden's got plenty of water, win-win for everyone. It's really hot and dry in Adelaide too, so this garden's probably doing a bit better than some of the others. Some of the others are going dry. This one's actually got algae growing along it because it gets so much water in it that it's growing algae in Adelaide, which is one of the hottest, driest cities in Australia. So it's quite remarkable. So that's location and some of the thinking about integration. We also need to think about site conditions. So we don't want too much grade or slope on a rain garden because we need the water to soak into it. So ideally you want probably a less than about a 5% slope. And if you've got slope, you may have to use check dams or something like that to sort of break up the slope and get water into it. But they get really messy and complicated once you have to deal with that. Another tip is to look for your existing stormwater curb entry or stormwater inlet pits. So where you want your rain garden is immediately upstream of that stormwater inlet pit, because that tells you if the drainage engineers, you guys, have decided that that's the appropriate spot to put the stormwater inlet pits along the road, that's the maximum catchment that you can get into that system. So we don't want to be putting the rain garden at the top of the catchment, we want to put it at the bottom of it. So where that inlet is, that's where we'll get the most amount of water coming off that road into that location. So that's where we want the rain garden. And then when it overflows, it can spill into that inlet pit. Think about road crossfall. Usually you've got a crown and that's grading to the outside. So what that often means is that we can only get half of the road draining into our rain garden. Occasionally we're lucky and they've done a one-way crossfall and the whole road's grading one way and we can get the whole road into one. It's not the norm. And the other thing one other thing to think about is sight lines. We're often building these right on the intersection, so we've got to think about people driving up to that intersection being able to look across and see the traffic. So when we choose the vegetation for these, we will, if we're on that corner, we will choose vegetation that's only half a metre or a metre tall at most, to make sure that people coming around the corner can see the vehicles coming towards them on the other side. And we're not going to put trees and shrubs that are going to block their view at that point. A couple of places where we try not to put rain gardens, where you can't get that grade or that fall to get the water into it and then through the system and then back to the underground drainage. Usually you need 700 or 800 mil between the ground surface that you're starting at and where your drainage is at the bottom to be able to get extended detention, a bit of grade into it, get it through the filter media and then get it back out again. So you can get away with 600 or 700 at a pinch to that outlet pipe if you have to, but ideally you want 700 or 800 mil. We try to be careful putting it in really big catchments, and especially those with lots of sediment, because then the sediment comes in, flows over the filter media and it clogs it up and blocks it, so it doesn't work effectively. So we either avoid that or we put a sediment pond upstream so that the sediment pond catches the sediment. The other thing with rain gardens is that these systems are designed to get wet during a storm and then dry out. So they're primarily dry systems that are aerobic in between storm events. When a storm event happens, they get wet and then the water flows through them and then they drain out and they dry out. Not completely dry, they've got a bit of moisture, but then they dry out. If we put these systems in a location where we've got a lot of base flow coming from a drain or a waterway, or if we put it directly onto a waterway, or if we put it downstream of a lake or a wetland, what happens is that they're getting water into them continually. And they're not really a rain garden anymore, they're more like a subsurface flow wetland or something like that. And what we get is we'll see algae start to grow on the top of it and it'll start to block up the surface. So we can get not just sediment clogging, but we can also get biological clogging, where it actually just grows algae right across the top and then it blocks it up. The water can't get through and then the problem compounds. We had one asset where this happened really badly in Melbourne, and it ended up looking like a wetland because it had so badly clogged the surface that the water was just ponding up on the top. So we don't want that if we can avoid it. The other thing is to think about is catchment. We've got to get a balance of the size of the rain garden and the size of the catchment. So if the catchment's too big, too much water's coming in, it's going to smash the system, too much hydraulic loading, too much sediment loading, rain garden's never going to do very well. So really, ideally, we wanted at least 1, maybe 2% of its catchment for it to have a decent chance at working well. Melbourne, we get away with 1%. We even go down to 0.6% musical. Our modelling system will let us do. But ideally, we wanted at least 1 or 2%. In going up to Queensland, we're looking at more like 3 or 4%. And realistically, for Bangkok, you're probably looking at those higher figures. If we want to get stormwater volume, so we're not just doing stormwater treatment, but we actually want to retain volume within the system and get passive irrigation, then we start looking at larger systems. So there might be 3%, there might be 5% of the catchment. And honestly, you can probably go to anything as big as 10% or sometimes even larger before you need to seriously start thinking about, oh, what if the system gets too dry because it's got not enough catchment coming into it? So yes, that can be a problem, but you're hardly ever going to be building a system that's 10% of its catchment, so you don't have to worry about it too much. What I would say is if you find yourself in a situation where your rain garden's a really big chunk of your catchment, either reconsider whether you can get a bigger catchment into it, or just make it a garden and let the water come into it. Just use regular soils, and then that will work better than having a system that's too freely draining.
Sorry, can you just explain the percentage of impervious catchment area? So why would it need to be greater in Bangkok?
Because you've got higher rainfall and higher rainfall intensities. So you'll get a greater loading of water coming through the year. So put it in perspective, we get about 650 to 750 millimetres of rainfall a year in Melbourne. You guys get at least double that in Bangkok. Someone here probably knows the numbers better than I do. I just googled it last night. It was about 1,600. So you get way more rainfall than we do. So there's more hydraulic loading on the system. So you need to have a larger asset that can handle that. The second thing is that your rainfall intensity is off the charts compared to what we get here. So when you get storms, you get bigger storms. So you're going to need a bigger asset to handle those conditions and balance out. Doesn't mean it won't work. But the more hydraulic loading you put on the system, the more pressure it's under, the more you're going to have to maintain it. So if you get slightly bigger systems, that will help. But it's a balance of cost. The bigger you make it, the more it costs. So you've got to try and weigh that up.
Yeah. So they look confused. Maybe I just draw the diagram.
So,
Get turbines.
yeah, do you want to stop it?
Well, we are about half an hour behind, and we could have it created. I'm just checking. Okay, yeah, so if you, do you think if you stop at like 11:15? Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay.
So what they were talking about, if you look at, if the x-axis is the percentage of your treatment system divided by the catchment area, and this is the percentage of the volume that is going through the treatment system versus the total runoff. Because they give you a very perspective in terms of why Melbourne is going to like 1 or 2%, because we're really trying to capture the graph that is very steep. That's not most cost effective, but also meeting the objectives of 45% reduction of total nitrogen, total phosphorus. But in Bangkok, what we are looking at is that we need to produce a Bangkok curve. I don't know, it could be something like this. But it's about finding out where is the most cost effective zones that you build system, because once you build system around this zone, it's approaching diminishing return. Because the additional increase in catchment in the treatment area, it gives you a very marginal increase in the additional percentage of runoff you treated. There's no point going that way. But in Bangkok, it's more about how do we capture that stormwater, so it stops it from going into your combined sewer. Because this is only talking about minor storm events, right? This is about managing that stormwater in terms of how do we attenuate it and reduce the total amount going into your combined sewer. That's the problem in Bangkok. We have no problem in Melbourne because we have separate sewers. We have one pipe for the wastewater, one pipe for stormwater. They don't combine, they don't cross. But in Bangkok, is that how do we design a system to it is in a cost-effective way, but also trying to, let's say, retain 80% of the total volume of stormwater across the year. And what will be that percentage? We have to do modeling. Right? That's something that we have to do it. But hopefully that puts something in context of Bangkok. Thanks, Dale. Thank you.
So in Melbourne, like the objectives are to reduce the amount of stormwater and the amount of nutrients going into the...
So the main objective in Melbourne is to reduce the amount of nitrogen going to Port Phillip Bay.
All right.
And the target for that is 45%. So that's what people are designing to, because that's what they have to do. You could design for more, but that's what people have been told they have to do, so that's what they're designed for. So that means that we're getting systems that are sized to meet that particular objective, because that's what we're trying to achieve.
Okay. So in Bangkok, you would need to design a system that aligns with your objective and find the optimal place on that curve.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And we're shifting in Melbourne because we're starting to say we actually need to be chasing volume as well to protect our waterways, because it's not just about Port Phillip Bay. If we're in South Melbourne or something, it's about Port Phillip Bay and all we care about is nitrogen. Design it for 45%, we'll make it 1% of catchment. But if we're in Little Stringy Bark Creek up in the Dandenongs, or Listerfield Lake, where you guys are going to go in a couple of days, there's beautiful waterways there that are pristine, and there's only little townships draining into them, and every bit of urban catchment that goes into them is damaging them. We want to stop as much of that urban water going into them as possible. That's where you start going, well, let's make this system really big, because then it can absorb and retain all the water, and then you might get 5% of your catchment.
Yeah, that's great. We're going to take them to see Gardiner Creek.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. So plants is the other thing that's really important. Biofilters are not sand filters, they're biofilters. They work because they've got plants growing in them, and those plants bring with them a whole heap of other life. So you have all these microbes growing in the soil, and those microbes help to facilitate the reactions that break down nutrients so that the plants can access them, and then the plants take up those nutrients to grow. So we need the plants, we need the microbes, we need all the other life that comes with it for these systems to be effective. And what's been shown time and again with the research experiments, and Jummin and his team here are doing some, but what's been shown over and over with the research is that if you've got these systems and you've got plants in them, they're much better at removing the nutrients, particularly the nitrogen, and actually retaining and capturing that. A sand filter will work great for 6 months, but then it'll reach its capacity and then we'll just start letting the nutrients go straight through. Whereas the planted systems will help to retain those nutrients over time. We have a few species that have been tested. This is a little bit dated now, but basically grasses and sedges are the things that generally work the best in the Australian context. So we have this plant called Carex or Carex oppressor. That's by far, by a mile, the most widely used plant in biofilters in Melbourne and in Australia. And you go and look at any biofilter, you'll probably see some of this. We probably overuse it because we use it everywhere, but it's green, it grows well, it looks nice, but we could do with a few flowers in some of these, I think. Juncus is another one. Different Juncus species actually grow really well, they're really hardy, kind of bulletproof. The good thing about both of these is they can go about 3 or 4 weeks with no rainfall at all, no water in the soil, and they'll survive just fine. So they get through our really hot, dry summers. It rained on, I think, the 23rd of December last year, and then there was no significant water in my rainwater tank until about the 26th of January. So that's a month with no rain at all. So they'll survive that. Melaleucas are good for a couple of reasons. So trees, they need a bit more depth. They're good because they grow really well in their systems. They'll handle the wet conditions, they'll handle the dry conditions, but they also have another property. They're antibacterial. So they'll actually help to kill the pathogens within the water. So if you've got a bit of sewer overflow getting into the system, it'll actually help to kill some of those pathogens off. These other ones, they're listed here, but honestly they're more terrestrial species and they'll do better on the batters or in a system that's going to be fairly dry, but they'll struggle in a system that's overly wet or that's getting water too frequently. So they actually some of these didn't do very well in the lab studies, but that's probably because in the lab we were basically watering these systems every 3 days to try and run through as much as we could in a year and see how much water we could load them up with, but it was more representative of a fairly wet system, so they didn't perform too well.
So just a question on plants. So
Yeah.
like obviously in Thailand you would need different plants, and obviously one of the key issues is that it's very wet during the wet rainy season and no rain during the dry season. So if that is the case, like would you need to irrigate these rain gardens during the dry season?
So it's worth considering that. Firstly, I would say look and ask what species do you have that can handle wet and dry conditions. Often coastal species are what we've found works well here, because they tend to cope with the sandier conditions as well, because we're often putting sandy media in these systems. Honestly, you're talking 3 or 4 months with hardly any rainfall. You need to think about irrigation. If you're irrigating your gardens around it, you need to consider irrigating your own gardens. And no one likes it when I tell them that, because they want to hear we're putting in a passively irrigated system and it'll look after itself. You don't need to irrigate it, you don't need to maintain it, and that's what we like to tell people. If you're going to go 2 months or 3 months without rain, nothing is going to survive it. So be prepared to irrigate them if you really want, really nice green-looking things and you want a wide diversity of plants. If you're prepared to pick the tough, hardy species that are bulletproof, okay, you'll probably get away without irrigating it, and you'll be fine. But I would suggest that in higher amenity landscapes, that you do consider including irrigation within the systems in Thailand as well. And we've recommended similar in other places.
Yeah. Thanks, Catherine. I think the key idea, we probably should say this at the beginning yesterday, is that we're here to learn how Melbourne is dealing with Melbourne's problem. It's not about copy and pasting. It's more about understanding the principle, the strategy Dale described, how the whole industry, like they'll talk about solve Melbourne's problem. Right? So for example, the question that if the 4 or 5 months drought in Bangkok, in Thailand, there are many ways to deal with this, right? Like they'll talk about drought tolerant species, even introducing the saturated zones because you have a water bank at the bottom. That's one way. The other way is we can be really innovative. Maybe we can have a dual functional barrier retention system that dealing with the grey water and the storm water at the same time, which means that for the 5 months you have no rain, you use grey water to treat it, right? So it's really thinking beyond the lines, not just dealing with storm water, right? Think about if this valve filter, like the one you saw this morning, can deal with both storm water but also grey water, then you have no problem. You don't have to irrigate it, and it's all passive. Unless the 5 months there's no people living in the household, otherwise you have a constant supply of grey water coming from household and keep it wet. Yeah. And the key idea is that don't lock your thinking in just this solution. Learn this principle, and then think about back home how you solve your unique problem.
We've designed these in Melbourne, Sydney, Queensland. We've put them in Singapore to jump in, been involved in that. We've built rain gardens in the Middle East. One location, 8 days of rainfall a year. So think about it, 8 days of rainfall a year. So that system we actually designed to treat groundwater because they had contaminated groundwater. So we're pumping groundwater back up through the system, treating the groundwater, and then recharging the groundwater. And then when it did rain, because when it rained it poured, when they actually got rain, we were actually taking that water and injecting it back into the groundwater because they have the same problem that you have in Bangkok, that the groundwater aquifers are dropping. And they need to try and recharge and restore them, so they were using it to then recharge the groundwater with whatever stormwater they could get. So, think laterally. Good idea. So what also with plants too is that what works in Australia is not going to work in Thailand. Plants is a particular thing. You're going to have to look around, talk to your ecologists, find out what plant species you've got that are going to work. Us engineers like to think we know all this, but it's really important to get the plants right. So go and talk to the ecologists, go and talk to the arborists and get their ideas on what plants are going to grow well and work in these conditions, because they'll come up with something, they'll be able to come up with a few plants that work. Pretty much covers it. Okay. So I would like to talk about maintenance. So we had the question yesterday on how do we maintain these systems and how do we look after them. So I thought I'd better make sure that I talk a little bit about the maintenance for biofilters. So when we go and inspect a biofilter, some of the things we're looking for are blockage, where inlets or outlets are blocked up, is particularly important because if the outlet gets blocked, the system fills up with water, just like a wetland, that can kill the plants pretty quickly. Or alternatively, if the inlet's blocked, water can't get into the system, and then suddenly it's got no water for 2 months on end, and then all the plants die because they're not getting watered. My little townhouse one I showed you before, that actually had the inlet got blocked. It's only once it's ever happened in 5 years. It was the only maintenance it ever needed, but the inlet got blocked up and I had to unblock that so that it could get water into it. So it's something that's important to check frequently. It doesn't happen often, but important. Surface levels is another big one. We find time and again that when people construct these, they bring out the material and they go, okay, we need this much material to build the system, we'll get a bit extra just to be safe. They get there, they put the system, they build it up to the level it's at, and you've got a bit of sand left over. What you can do, you put it on the truck and take it away. It's a hole in the ground, no one's going to notice. Chuck the sand in, fill it up, bang, extended detention's gone. We've just filled it all the way to the gut curve to the overflow, and you've got no extended detention depth. So happens all the time. So you've got to make sure that that surface level is at the right level. Even if they get it right, contractors come along to do maintenance. They go, oh, the mulch is getting a bit thin, we'll fix that. Gravel mulch, in we go. 100 mil of gravel mulch, extended detention's gone. So always got to look at the levels and make sure that they're what they're meant to be. Permeability. We have clay soils in most of Melbourne, and so if it's a stable catchment, we usually don't have a problem. But when someone's doing construction upstream, and then they dig up the subsoil and they disturb the soil, and then we get a storm event and then it washes all that fine soil in, what we can get is fine sediment and clay caking the top of the biofilter and creating a fine layer. Sometimes that builds up, and then the water can't get through it and it blocks up and it clogs the system. So then we have to come and scrape all of that sediment off, pull the plants out because you can't get the sediment out without pulling the plants out, scrape the whole thing off, reinstate the media and replant. So that's pretty much the only solution. It was the thing we were most worried about when we first started doing biofilters. To be honest, it's probably not the most common issue I see. It does happen, but it doesn't happen that often. Where we do see it is in new estates where there's lots of construction going on, there's lots of sediment moving. But in established urban areas, we don't see it too frequently. And then the common but not too difficult things, you're going to get rubbish. No matter what you do, your biofilters are going to catch rubbish getting washed down into the system. You're going to have to come and pull the rubbish out. You say, well, that's a maintenance cost and a hazard. Think about it this way. It's better that the rubbish is caught in the rain garden and you're pulling it out of that than it's washing out into the waterway and it's washing it out into the bay, because it's really hard to get rubbish out of the bay once it's there. So better we catch it here, we can just go and pick it up and take it away. It's also good because it means that the people that live on that street that are chucking their rubbish in the street get to see it every day. So it's an incentive for them not to chuck their rubbish out because they're going to see it. Whereas if they chuck it in the drain that gets washed away, they don't see it, it doesn't bother them. So put it in their face and might do something about it. So plant cover, you've got to make sure you've got good coverage so it's keeping the weeds out. If you've got gaps, come and replant them. That'll help to get the weeds suppressed. Look at the health. A good ecologist will be able to look at the plants and go, these plants are too wet. We need to modify the wet and dry conditions. We need to put some different plants in. These plants are too dry. We need to change the species because they're not coping with these conditions. And then obviously weeds, we weed them. They do grow weeds sometimes, but then also damage. We get pedestrians walking through our rain garden because it was a nice location to walk for some reason. We get cars driving into them and tyre ruts being worn through them, all sorts of things going on. So we've got to fix that. So check your surface level. In this case, this bit here is at the right level, but the rest of it's too high. So this whole thing needs to be scraped down and dug out to get it to the level that the water can actually drain from the road into the system. This one got the same problem. They've filled up the extended detention, filled up the surface, the filter media, all the way up to the overflow. So again, we need to dig it out. So we do actually have processes for doing inspections for our biofilters or our rain gardens in Australia now. When we first started, we thought, oh, we won't need to maintain these, they're natural, they'll be great. But they're natural systems in an urban setting, and so they're under a lot more pressure than just a normal garden might be, or something in a rural area. So we have a checklist, and it says check the permeability and clogging, check the surface levels, check the plants, check the weeds, identify how bad the situation is, and then let's say this council's got 50 biofilters, rain gardens. They'll look at the scores and the results for these. We'll make some notes. We'll write up what maintenance actions are needed for each of them, and then they'll make an action plan, and then they'll give it to their maintenance contractors and say, here's our list of problems, go and solve them. Or they'll say, we've only got 10 grand this year, we can only fix 5 of our biofilters. So they'll say, there's 5 of the ones that we can fix and get them back to a good condition. So go and fix these ones and improve them and solve the problems in those. These other ones we're just going to have to leave, and we'll come back and do them next year. That's the reality. Even in Australia, we struggle with adequate maintenance budgets to look after all our assets. So it's an ongoing challenge. But these checklists are available, obviously, as with everything. Adapt to suit your local systems in Thailand. You'll have different asset management processes and systems in place. You'll need to modify and adapt them to suit that. I would suggest, as soon as you start building these systems, start thinking about these as an asset and start asking the question, how do we get this added to our asset management systems? I'm sure that your department has some asset management systems, and you know where all your irrigation channels are and how long they are and what condition they're in, which ones need to be cleaned out. I'm sure you're already tracking that kind of thing. These systems are always a work in progress and improving, but you want to get these biofilters and your other assets on those systems as soon as you can, because the sooner they're on a system, the sooner that someone's tracking them, they're aware of them, they know they need to be managed and maintained, and the sooner you can get them in the accounting systems, the sooner you can have someone saying, oh, how come you're not spending money looking after these systems, or why are their systems degrading? Are we doing something about it? So inlets, main thing is just make sure the water can get into the system. Clear out any sediment that's blocking it. If it's scoured, because sometimes you get scour because the water's coming through too quickly, you might have to replant, reprofile. This one looks like it's probably been damaged at the inlet because the water's coming in quite quickly, so you need to replant around here. Clean out the stuff that's accumulated. That's a really common issue. But typically, when you come and look at these systems, what you need to do, apart from cleaning out the inlets and outlets and taking any sediment or litter out, everything else you do is looking after a garden. You're weeding, you're pruning the plants, you're replanting. It's not rocket science. It's not really difficult. It's nothing that your maintenance contractors or your landscape contractors can't handle. They just need a little bit of training to look for these extra things about making sure the inlets and the outlets are working and that they're cleaning out the sediment. That's all there is to it, really. A couple of examples. This one you can see there's no plants here. You can see a couple of dead ones. No plants here, no plants here. What happened? Well, they planted the plants in bands. So that's one type of plant. This is a kangaroo paw, different type of plant. This one's growing great. Nothing here. This one's growing great. So what it's telling us is that these two species are doing well in this rain garden. This one wasn't such a good choice. So you can come back and plant what was designed, but you're probably going to get the same thing happen. So what we'll probably do is say, well, these are going well, let's put more of these in. Or you can, if you want to keep that banded look, you can choose another species that's similar to these that you know will survive, and you can put it in there. So we can learn as we go. Plant 5 species, which one survived, we'll use them next time. Yep. All right, overfilling. I'll mention it just because it's the single biggest problem we see is people stuff it up at construction, too much filter media, too much cobblestones, too much gravel, and then the water can't get into the system. It's the biggest challenge we face when we look at these systems. So getting that construction right is really important. So, and I'll just leave you with a couple of pages of resources. These are all on the slides, so you don't have to scribble them down. You'll have them later. So that's the adoption guidelines that have been translated. That's the Melbourne Water one that I mentioned. And then if you are trying to do some modelling, there's also some guidelines on how to model these assets. So that's it. All right. Time, I've used my extra time, so I'll hold there and let you guys have some morning tea. We'll come back and talk about some other NBS. So.
If anyone wants to use the toilet.
So